Να ξεκινήσουμε σιγά σιγά. Έτσι, γιατί έχουμε και μία πίεση χρόνου και δεν θα θέλαμε να στερήσουμε χρόνο από τον ομιλητή. Έχω σήμερα τη χαρά και την τιμή να παρουσιάσω τον καθηγητή του King's College, Patrick Leman. Πριν ξεκινήσει την ομιλία του, θα μου επιτρέψετε να πω δύο λόγια για την ακαδημαϊκή, επιστημονική και επαγγελματική του πορεία. Ο Patrick Leman έχει σπουδάσει στο St. Edmund's Hall, έχει πραγματοποιήσει μεταπτυχιακές σπουδές στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης και απέκτησε το διδακτορικό του δίπλωμα από το Corpus Christi College του Πανεπιστημίου του Cambridge. Τα ερευνητικά του ενδιαφέροντα εστιάζονται στη μάθηση και την κοινωνική ανάπτυξη των παιδιών. Το μεγαλύτερο μέρος του επιστημονικού του έργου επικεντρώνεται στη σύνδεση μεταξύ φύλου, εθνότητας και εκπαίδευσης και την επικοινωνία και συνεργασία των συνομήλικων παιδιών. Πριν το King's College, ο Patrick Leman έχει εργαστεί σε κορυφαία πανεπιστήμια όπως το Royal Holloway, το Goldsmith College και τα πανεπιστήμια του Λονδίνου και του Cambridge. Είναι επίτιμο μέλος της Βρετανικής Ψυχολογικής Εταιρείας και εκδότης του επιστημονικού περιοδικού του κλάδου της Αναπτυξιακής Ψυχολογίας, British Journal of Developmental Psychology. Το θέμα το οποίο θα μας αναπτύξει σήμερα είναι ένα θέμα εχμής στην ψυχολογία της ανθρώπινης ανάπτυξης και αφορά τις αλληλεπιδράσεις των ομήλικων παιδιών. Και εδώ θα σταματήσω. Professor Leman, on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome you to the University of Thessaly and our Congress on Developmental Psychology. So after my short introduction, I suppose we're ready to start.
Eleni, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. As I said, I'm not entirely sure what you said, but it sounded good. And I recognized some of the locations where I've studied and worked, so it's mostly accurate, I think. It's a real honor to be here, a real pleasure to be here as well, to get the opportunity to talk to you about my work. I hope there'll be some time for some questions at the end. I'm sure there will be questions at the end because, as Elias said yesterday, one of the key features of developmental psychology is about solving a puzzle. How do we fit those different aspects of children's growth, maturation, social contexts, genetic background? How do we fit all those different elements together to try and understand what causes positive change in individuals, families, communities, and societies? So thank you, it's a great honor. Thank you in particular to Fanny, but I know there are lots of other people, but Fanny has put up with my inconsistent approach to answering emails on time, so I apologize for that now. And thank you as well. I arrived in Athens yesterday, or the day before yesterday, came here today, and I have to say, beautiful country, and people have been so fantastically friendly and warm. And I think that that's clearly the case, having been here last night at the reception. So thank you so much. I will try and keep this within 40 minutes, 45 minutes, so that we can all go off to lunch. I guess it's lunch after this. Is it lunch after this? No, maybe not. Oh, there's more after this. Okay, well, I'll try and keep it quick anyway. So, as Eleni said, I'm currently head of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. It's the second biggest centre for research and education in psychiatry and psychology applied to mental health in the world. I myself am a psychologist. I started off as a developmental psychologist. I played around with social psychology. I dabbled in cognitive psychology, and I think I've ended up in educational psychology, but I'll let you be the judges of this. My point is that as someone who also studies social identity, I personally have a very confused one when it comes to my work profile. And lastly, I want to say too that one thing that Elias said last night was talking about how development is a process of evolution or growth, and again, it's understanding a puzzle. And it's absolutely true that the turn in developmental psychology, certainly in the UK and the US, is towards understanding development as a lifespan process, particularly in adulthood and also in older adulthood, given the demands that there are from society in economic terms from older adults. So I think there's a huge opportunity to look at adult development. I'm not going to be talking about that today, though, because all my work has been with children and early adolescents. But I would say that my own take on this developmental process is that, yes, it's a process of growth, of change, of evolution, but also in the place where Jason set sail from, it's also fundamentally a journey. And understanding that journey and what causes people to set off on different paths, to succeed and sometimes to fail, sometimes to choose different paths, I think that's a great metaphor for understanding development across the lifespan. Having said those words, those fine words, I'm now going to talk about my research for the next 35, 40 minutes or so, which, as I indicated, focuses on children from school age until around early adolescence, although increasingly my research is looking at older adolescents. And as you can guess from the title of this presentation, I'm going to focus on children's peer interactions. That's child-to-child interactions. And of course, that's not to deny that children's interactions with their parents, their teachers, with the media, with a whole range of non-peers is not absolutely essential to framing their growth. But what I want to ask from a developmental, what I want to argue from a developmental perspective is that there's something rather special about children's conversations, communication, and problem solving with children who are their peers, who are roughly their own age. It's through those interactions, I want to argue, that children develop a sense of self and a sense of specifically autonomous self, a sense of who they are. And peer interaction affords children opportunities for self-discovery that parent-child interaction, for example, does not. It's a more symmetric form of interaction. And I would urge all of you, however old you are, whoever your peers are, to think about the different influences on your life in the past and in the present, in terms of your interactions, sense of self, and in terms of your learning. There's something different when you sit down in an unconstrained or a less constrained conversation with your classmates than there is when you sit down with one of your professors. There's a different dynamic to the interaction, and it gives different opportunities for development. Now, my work is rather experimental. I'm aware I've been speaking too long already about this. So let me give you an overview of this presentation, and then I'll get down to some of the studies to develop the points that I just prefaced for this lecture. I'm going to start very quickly by talking about the social origins of development. For me, development is an intersection of different domains of a discipline, but fundamentally what interests me is the sense in which we are social animals, that our sense of self, our learning, comes from communication with other human beings. It comes through language and through the exchange of information and the development of social relationships. I'll then move to talk, which will be the main part of this presentation, about the development of peer interaction and how that connects with learning in the classroom, but applies to a whole range of different learning situations. I then want to ask what makes peer interaction effective for learning and development. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some of the other consequences of peer interaction, looking more specifically at the social consequences of peer interaction. So let me start with the social origins of development. As I said, we're fundamentally social beings. Anyone has seen this. This is Developmental Psychology 101 lecture. These are the There's been some controversy about the Fantz garbled face stimuli recently, but these are the Fantz faces, which have been used as evidence to suggest that infants show a preference for human faces over other stimuli. So they're hardwired to look for opportunities for what will become social interaction. There are also evolutionary arguments for collaboration, for why we engage in social interactions and why we cooperate with one another. I'm going to show you very quickly a video from Felix Warneken and Mike Tomasello, which demonstrates how even a very young toddler can act in a way that is fundamentally, I think, altruistic in terms of helping someone else. So let's hope this works.
Oh. Oh. So.
Okay, so this is a toddler who has understood the situation, quite a lot of complex information being processed there. But not all people behave like this. Some people would stay standing in the corner even when they're 27. But this toddler instinctively goes to help, recognizes that there's a sense of purpose, there's a shared goal here. Fundamentally, I think we are intrinsically altruistic. There's some controversy over that as well, but fundamentally, I think that's the case. So there are a variety of studies which point to the sense in which we are fundamentally social individuals. But as I suggested just then, not all interactions, sadly, are positive, and not all interactions are effective. For example, not all preschoolers fully understand interaction, so up until around 5, 6 years of age, they won't play in a coordinated way. Looking right back at Piaget's early studies, they'll play in parallel. They won't understand the rules of a game in a game or in a moral sense as well. And it's also true to say that these very early interactions from infancy, probably regressing decreasingly through childhood, tend to be dominated by asymmetry or authority relations in adult-child interaction. That's not surprising. Infants, children are very dependent on adults for a whole load of fundamental needs. But we can see that in other interactions too, and a study at the start of my career with Gerard Duveen at Cambridge explored that in some more detail. This last point really just underscores what I said, that there's something special about peer interaction. And just to give a summary of that, there is something special about child-child or peer interactions. There's also some practical differences between peer interaction and adult-child interaction. In peer interaction, children generally have more airtime. They get more opportunity to contribute to a conversation. They can make more independent decisions. If their parents have gone away or given up on the argument completely, they have to sometimes resolve those conflicts for themselves. And as I said, they need to learn to negotiate those relations autonomously for themselves. So, a first question to answer. Are we then really predestined to act socially? Well, yes, I think we are in many ways. The infant's brain is ready for social engagement. There's a preference for certain types of social acts over non-social acts. And if you just do a thought experiment, you can see that language is fundamental to thinking, to psychology, and of course, that means that we are built for communication. But there are other ways in which we may not, or at least there are ways in which children still have to learn how to develop communication skills. For example, do children really understand the nuances, the details of adult social relationships? Do any of us understand those details? When do children pick up the ways in which culture and society frames those social interactions? And are young children able to interact effectively, which will be the main focus of this? So the first study I'm going to talk about is a study that I conducted about 5 years ago. I won't go into the experimental details. One of the papers has just come out in Child Development on this. It was a project which sought to explore how a child's race or ethnicity influenced their communication with their classmates. And we had children who were around 8 and 9 years of age, and we got them to interact in the classroom with a peer, with a child from the same class but who wasn't a best friend or a worst enemy. And we asked them to play together, but we asked one group of children to solve science tasks together, each day for one whole week. We looked at their science understanding beforehand, we looked at their science understanding afterwards, and then 6 weeks and 6 months later. We also looked at how those interactions affected their relationships, and there might be time to talk about some of that at the end as well. But this study was conducted in Slough. Anyone who's ever been to London and flown into Heathrow will have flown over Slough. In the UK, Slough has the reputation as being the worst town in the south of England. It's incredibly ethnically diverse. That's not a reason for it being bad, that's a reason for it being great. I live quite near to Slough. They do fantastic Indian food. And it meant that it was a great place to study a multiracial context outside of central London, where in fact racial groups are rather more segregated than they are in Slough. But it's had its fair share of social problems. It was awarded the dubious title of being England's least tranquil area, and it's inspired poets and comedians. This first poem is known by every school child in the UK. It's by the former poet laureate, the royal poet, Sir John Betjeman, written in the 1950s. And you can see it's not very complimentary. Come friendly bombs and fall on Slough, it is not fit for humans now. And as you can see, it wasn't a town blessed with positive architectural input. Even funnier still, I think, is Jimmy Carr. He's a British comedian who said in 2005, I grew up in Slough in the 1970s. If you want to know what Slough was like in the 1970s, go there now. That gets a bigger audience, a laugh from a British audience, because they know Slough. So if you want to Google it or visit, feel free to do so. So what did we find? Well, I'll tell you very briefly the key take-home point from this study in the context of what do children learn from interaction, or rather, is peer interaction beneficial for learning? The answer unequivocally is yes. It is beneficial for learning. I'll explain this very quickly, but the baseline is the group of children who didn't engage in interaction. And in fact, we had another control group who just engaged in peer play for a week, and another control group who did science tasks on their own. And the key finding for us, which is a positive finding, is that all those pairs of children who solved science tasks together benefited from that interaction immediately and subsequently. And importantly, it didn't depend on the ethnic or racial mix of the pair. All children benefited from interaction in terms of learning science. And that's a consistent finding from a whole stack of researchers in the field. Willem Dwars and Gabriel Mouni found the same when they looked at socio-cognitive conflict. And my good friend Haris Pasaltis and Anna Zipiti also have explored these ideas in Nicosia in a series of studies trying to understand what it is that's effective about peer interaction. I've explored this in the context of moral development, and others have explored this in the context of science learning. So if you're a teacher and you want your children to learn, getting them to learn together is good. It's not the only thing you should do, but it's good. But we know that not all our interactions are positive or productive. They don't always lead to learning. Sometimes you actually need to focus about beliefs on a content. You need to really argue about a point. But sometimes it's just a big fight and no one gets anywhere in terms of learning at all. I'm going to show you now a clip from YouTube of two very young children engaging in conflict to give you a sense of what happens when social interaction fails. So this is an early example of an interaction between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Although the debating standards have gone down since then, so they'll be coming back later. So, not all communication, not all interaction is productive, but a lot of it can be. Maybe this is something that children need to learn, how to make communication useful to them. So from a developmental perspective, is a child's age important? The first study that I conducted for my PhD, again with Gérard Duveen, tried to understand whether communication and interaction between children was different at different age groups. What we did was we looked at children who were 6 years old, and they were paired together with a child who was, okay, didn't expect the slide here, but I'll just put it here. They were paired together with a child who was also 6 years old, or a 12-year-old was paired with a 12-year-old. And we gave them a very simple task. We asked them to discuss together whether two lines were the same length or different lengths. The trick was that we gave them a picture which was a variation on the Ponzo illusion. Now, the Ponzo illusion is the railway tracks illusion. And here are my two youngest children to demonstrate that illusion. Some years ago, this is a little bit of an insight into the Leman family home. My youngest daughter, Hannah, there is intimidating her second oldest sister, Ella, and it's a perspective difference. Here's another example of the perspective difference, which might be more familiar. So two lines the same length look different when there are different perceptual cues around them. So we asked children to discuss this together. The 6-year-old talked with other 6-year-olds. The 12-year-olds talked with other 12-year-olds. What we found was that the 6-year-olds, the 12-year-olds had quite good conversations. They asked a lot of questions about why the other person thought it was longer or shorter, how they could tell. But the 6-year-olds didn't really get that far. The 6-year-old conversations were a little bit like that conversation we just saw. I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. And they went on for quite a long time without discussing the reasons for their beliefs. And even when we gave those younger children some sticks to measure those lines, they still had trouble overcoming those disagreements. And just as a little aside, the 6-year-olds, when they were given an expert judgment, had particular problems when that expertise came from a girl rather than from a boy. Both boys and girls had problems with female expertise in this study. More on that later. Another study with colleagues at Max Planck in Berlin, Monica Keller, Michaela Gumerum, and Masunori Takazawa. This was a study using economic games. I don't know if you're familiar with them. It's a task where you give a pile of money and say, well, you can distribute this to another group. How much are you going to keep for yourself? How much are you going to give to another group? There's different variations on that game. There's a dictator game where you're told you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. You'll keep whatever money you get. And there's another game called the ultimatum game. And in the ultimatum game, the group of children or the child is told, you can choose how much you give the group, but the other group can either accept or reject that offer. If they accept it, everyone's fine. If they reject it, no one gets anything. It's a kind of game theory, prisoner's dilemma version. What we found, I will go quite quickly because I am aware of time. These were children 7 to 17 years of age. Now, well, I started talking about gender. It's going to come back in just a moment. But the good news is most people are very nice, and even in the dictator game, they give 50-50. They give equal shares. There is a gender difference, though, and the gender difference is that the girls in our study, maybe this is just British girls, were a bit nicer than the boys in terms of how much they gave. It narrows a little in early adolescence and mid-adolescence, but I'm afraid the trajectory is not looking good for men in terms of altruistic giving. I'm going to skip over the next slide and go to the key point here because I think it's going to take too much time to run through it. But the fundamental finding from this is that if you compare the children's performance on those games from 7 to 17 years of age, it was quite clear that the 7-year-olds didn't understand the strategy. They couldn't understand strategically how another group would respond to an unfair offer. From 9 years onwards, those children understood it, but there's something missing in these 7-year-olds' group understanding that allows them to make judgments about how other groups or how other groups and other people will respond in this interactive context. Another study with my friend Michaela Gumerum, this is a study which explored the phenomenon of collaborative memory. So this is my sojourn into cognitive psychology. Hold tight, here we go. Also with Zoe Oldham and Tara Hollins, these studies, a series of studies. Now, collaborative memory is a very interesting phenomenon. If I asked you individually to remember a word list and then recall it 3 minutes later after an intervening distraction task, you'd get a certain number of those right. If I asked 2 of you to do that and we added your scores together and crossed out the repeats, you'd get a certain number of those right. But if I asked you to remember them, go away, and then come back and remember them together, so in communication with another person, try and remember together those word lists, you would perform worse as a pair than if I put you together as a nominal pair, if I put 2 individuals who recalled independently. So adults are worse at recalling these word lists when they do it in pairs or in a group. Why does that happen? Well, I'll tell you in just a moment. But do you get that fundamental idea, yeah? That collaborating, remembering together on these word lists is worse than remembering on your own on these word list tasks. So here's a little graphic to help you out. They're back again. So these are two people who have been asked to remember some things together. But first of all, on their own, we give them lists of words. They could be any words. We could just make up a list of words. So here are some words we've asked them to remember. Hillary's prepared. Donald, not so much. They've remembered them on their own. They haven't met yet. They haven't shaken hands or anything. Then we give them a distraction task. We ask them to go off for 3 minutes, do something unrelated to give them a chance to forget. So maybe Hillary goes off and starts coughing. And maybe Donald goes off and does whatever Donald does. Nice. So 3 minutes to do their own thing. And then we bring them back and we ask them to talk with each other to remember those words. And they say those words together, the ones that they can remember. Now, these are just a short list, so obviously they'd remember them all. But when they do it like this, they're worse than when they do the recall on their own. The reason for that is that different recall strategies interfere with one another. So Donald might have been using a primacy strategy. He remembered the first words on the list. Hillary used a recency strategy. She used the last words on the list. So Hillary started talking with the last words on the list, and of course, Donald interrupted with the first words on the list, which ruined Hillary's remembering, and so they performed worse on the task. It's a rather long explanation for this, but what do we find? We find that these 7 and 9-year-olds, so again it's 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds remembering together, perform very differently. If you look at the 9-year-olds first, those nominal groups, those are the ones who recalled independently. We made up the results afterwards. The real groups are the ones who actually sat down together and talked. And the nominal groups at 9 years perform much better than the real groups. So there's the net negative effect of collaborative recall. But the 7-year-olds, there's no difference between their performance at all. Absolutely none. They simply show the same levels of recall in nominal and real groups. And you can look at other aspects of those interactions. For example, conversations are longer amongst the older children. They're more focused. There's more meta-communication, generally more communication, and much more intersubjectivity, much more understanding of intersubjectivity. So, in answer to the first question, is children's peer interaction effective? Yes, but for different reasons at different ages. Up to around 8 years, it seems that it's a framework for rehearsing interactions and acquiring social skills. From 9 years of age, it's more intersubjective. It's more about collaboration between people and across groups. So this period of middle childhood seems an important period for learning and communicating with your peers in terms of certainly the classroom context and beyond. Now, I've spoken a bit here about the socio-cognitive context. And now I'm going to be quick. Every developmental process has a developmental history. And here's some of my developmental history. This is the standard fire brigade photograph that we are made to have in our schools in the UK. I don't know if you have the same in Greece. This is a primary school, first school in East London, the same school that David Beckham went to, but a few years later. And you can see that there's one particularly unattractive and badly dressed person there. That's me. Now, why is this important for learning? Because, of course, we can do these nice experimental tasks of learning, but learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context. And one of the key contexts for peer relations are their friendship groups and social networks. Now, I've been working over the last 5 years with colleagues in Sussex, in Arizona, and at Royal Holloway, where I was before, to try and understand the networks of relationships that children form in the classroom and how those in turn tie in with their learning processes. It's a huge task, but one that's definitely going to be worthwhile. So we try and understand this in graphical terms. This is a model of a classroom actually in the south of England. And we've looked at those children by the friends that they nominate or don't nominate for particular activities. And by doing that, we can see how those classrooms fit together. We can see which children are rejected, the grey circles. We can see who's popular, hooray, they're the green ones, lots of friends. Controversial, and other children as well. Now, of course, these change throughout development, but that social network, that social context is really important to try and understand how peer interactions happen. I'll come back to that in just a moment. I know I don't have long, but I'll go fast. How long have I got? 5 minutes. Very fast then. I'll just do the jokes. Right. One aspect of that context is gender. Now, we all know that male and female conversational styles are different. There's a whole heap of evidence about that. Men interact more, they demand more airtime. Those sorts of things. To give you a sense of this miscommunication, see what you think about this. This puzzles men, and it puzzles me as well, even though I've seen it 100 times. So a married couple are in a car. Wife turns to her husband and says, "Would you like to stop for a coffee?" He says no, because he doesn't want a coffee. And then she becomes angry. Why does that happen? Maybe you're all more direct in Greece, but no, very few English men, they kind of understand that's something they should try and understand, but they don't really get it. It's, you know. So there's a fundamental difference in the communication strategies and the approaches towards communication that children have. I've done some research on this. I'm not going to talk about the experiment that follows. It's quite an early experiment. But you can see that there's a particular developmental trajectory here. And one of the key themes of my research is that gender, ethnicity, social class, different aspects of a social identity intervene to disrupt communication. And part of learning about autonomy, identity, and yourself is understanding how you use how people perceive of you to work around those differences. Now, those differences are wrong. They're insidious. They're there in adult society, and children often try and reproduce them. And my argument is that by understanding how children learn to reproduce them, we can teach them not to reproduce them, not so we have a totally homogeneous style of communication, but so we don't slow down communication and learning, because the girls in the science class have to say, "Oh, it might be that. Do you think it might be that? What do you think?" Whereas the boys are saying, "It's that. Learn it." So gender's a really important aspect of communication, and I wanted to give a sense that those social identity issues are very important. Let me move on to the final slides, because I know that I'm running out of time, and you're going to see me whiz through this, I'm afraid. Okay, it's all available on the internet now, just, you know, or on video. If you freeze the video, you'll see the slides. Right, so is children's peer interaction effective? Yes, for different reasons at different ages. Middle childhood's a significant period. There's positive learning outcomes. There's also social outcomes, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but these interactions don't just affect learning, they affect the relationships between children, and we need to intervene to understand how those relationships can be more productive. There's also psychological outcomes. And just to finish here, again, I'll send these slides so everyone can get them. I want to talk very briefly about a study, a charity project that I've started based in London and the northwest of England, which is trying to apply some of these principles of peer collaboration to make positive psychological, learning, and social benefits for disadvantaged children. There is more on the website, www.whitewaterwriters.com. Very briefly, On Monday morning, a group of 10 children come into school. We put them in a classroom on their own with computers. No adult touches a computer. And by the close of school on Friday afternoon, they've written their own novel, an original collaborative novel, and they can download it. It's published on Amazon and on other booksellers are available. They can buy that book and it's printed as well for them. And we're exploring how these aspects, how we can frame those collaborations to make them really productive really quickly and see what the psychological, social, and cognitive and educational benefits of that interaction are. So, peer interaction is important for development. Learning how to interact is important. And something important is going on in middle childhood. But it doesn't solve all the problems about communication. There are still inequalities and issues that stop effective communication between adults. We need to try and understand what those are because, as I said, every psychological process has a developmental history. And by understanding that developmental history, I think we can make a real difference in terms of how children communicate, learn, and how we interact successfully socially as adults. And of course, collaborations can be productive and they can fall apart. They can be unproductive. Conflict can be great for promoting effective collaborations. So to sum up then, I'm reliably informed that says thank you. If it says a rude word, I'm very sorry. I'm not going to make any attempt to pronounce it. But I want to say a final word just briefly, and then hopefully there will be some time for some questions. I'm sorry that I've run through some of those slides. I'm very happy to talk about the work in more detail independently. Collaboration's important, and the social consequences are important. King's, London, the UK is a great place to come. We are very much open for business, in spite of messages you may have heard to the contrary. We have just inflicted one of the greatest acts of national self-harm in our history, but we're working on it. And here are some pictures from some of my colleagues at King's to show you just how international we are, just how collaboratively we are, and just how much we value cross-cultural communication. I'm sorry for running through those last bits. It was all brilliant. Thank you for liking the Donald Trump jokes. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. I suppose we have some time for questions. So are there any questions for Professor Leman?
One at the back. Is there one at the back?
Yes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Could you please explain briefly why the 6-year-old children than the 9-year-old children had differences in group collaboration? Because we see that the 6-year-old children were better than the 9-year-old. Thank you.
Are you asking about the collaborative memory study?
Yeah, why there was such a difference, because the 9-year-old were worse than 6-year-old children?
Sure. So the key point about collaborative recall, collaborative memory, is that adults are worse at that than they are at normal recall, individual recall. Now, the key point in developmental terms for me here is that younger children don't show that negative effect. It's one thing that 6-year-olds are better at than 9-year-olds and adults. Of course, their overall recall is poorer. Their independent recall is poorer because we know that memory improves across that age range. But the key thing is they're not showing the errors that adults make. There's a lot of interesting work coming out now on all the social psychology studies that have shown the errors that adults make using heuristics and the mistakes that you can make, they're learnt heuristics, they're learnt mistakes. And this is a task where 6-year-olds haven't learnt that social context, so they aren't learning the mistakes as well, so they outperform adults and 9-year-olds. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Το μικρόφωνο λίγο για να ακούγεστε.
Thank you so much for this exciting talk.
Thank you.
Well, the conclusion is that at some ages, children are not effective. And now effective in terms of solving a task. Well, what is their goal, actually? I mean, can it be that they have different goals? And that they maybe accomplish these different goals that they have, and so they are effective after all. I mean, in this video where the boy and the girl fight it, maybe they had the goal to
fight. It's a really very good question. Yes, maybe they do. I think my theoretical perspective here is that we can parse development off into cognitive, social, various different domains, but all these things interrelate. So the goals they have might be linked to their perceptions of friendship, and we know that children's peers become more important to them as friends and as sources of information as they get older as well. So you're right, maybe the goals are changing. I think they're different sides of the same coin. In terms of problem solving, we offer rewards for some of the tasks we've spoken about. There's still the reward there, and I think most of the children still want the rewards from performing well. I didn't get to talk about that one. So of course they still want those rewards, but it's more a misunderstanding of the ways that they achieve them. But I absolutely agree, there are some interactions where the goals will be different for children at different ages. It's a complex question, and it's a really good question as well. My sense is that there's a failure to be aware of the purpose of communication on top of any differences in goals as well. But it's a very, very good question. I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much.